Thank you very much. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you. I hope you feel the same when it's over. It's good to be with you, a real delight. And to say that it's a comfortable setting in which to stand would be really saying something that's not true. It's happy to be here, a delight to be here, but very daunting a task and a subject before me. The only comforting thing to me is that the MC is called Michael, and my colleague who will help me with the Q&A time is also Michael. So it's nice to have two archangels beside me as I begin a session such as this. I'm just coming off a week of writing. I was in Thailand, where I get away 2 or 3 times a year to just start or finish a book, and so this is the first time I'm speaking about 2 weeks. It might give my voice a bit of a challenge as I begin, but once it gets going, it'll get going, so we'll be all right. I want to tell you as I start that I wish I could say to you that when you begin a subject such as this, you're quite optimistic that you can find some ready solutions. I doubt that. I doubt we'll be able to agree on everything that is said, and I doubt also whether it'll change the course for some. But my singular goal, therefore, is this. Whatever our worldview, whatever our convictions, because a conviction is different to an opinion. An opinion is something that you have a preference for and a sort of hierarchy of options, and you make your choice this way, somebody else makes a choice another way. But a conviction is that which is actually then, in many ways, rooted in your soul. It is in your conscience. And to change a conviction will involve a changing of who you are as a person. So we're really not talking about preferences or opinions. And so when two worldviews collide, when two convictions collide, the best thing that one can hope for is at least the cordiality with which we can disagree and the civility with which we can interact in the midst of that disagreement. It has been my calling and my life to be in different settings. As a matter of fact, very interestingly enough, I was given a very similar theme to speak at, of all places, in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates, at Zayed University, just a few weeks ago. Now, the approach there I had to take was somewhat different because it's a completely different religious worldview, and the issues before them are quite significantly foreign to ours. But to be given a hearing, to be given a kind of cordial listening to, and by the faculty and members of at senior levels in the country, and to be invited by the Sheikh was itself quite an honor. And we walked away as friends with the hopes of coming back and discussing issues. So it'll be a heavy subject on hand. Before I get into the weightiness of it, I'd like to read for you a little bit of a light-hearted story. It's called A Touching Story. As a bagpiper, I play many gigs. Recently, I was asked by a funeral director to play at a graveside service for a homeless man. He had no family or friends, so the service was to be at a pauper cemetery in the Kentucky backcountry. As I was not familiar with the backwoods, I got lost. I finally arrived an hour late and saw the funeral guy had evidently gone, and the hearse was nowhere in sight. There were only the diggers and crew left, and they were eating their lunch. I felt bad and apologized to the men for being late. I went to the side of the grave and looked down, and the vault lid was already in place. I didn't know what else to do, so I started to play. The workers put down their lunches and began to gather round. I played out my heart and soul for this man with no family and friends. I played like I'd never played before for this homeless man. And as I played Amazing Grace, the workers began to weep. They wept, I wept, we all wept together. When I finished, I packed up my bagpipes and started for my car. Though my head hung low, my heart was full. As I opened the door to my car, I heard one of the workers saying, "Never seen nothing like that before, and I've been putting in septic tanks for 20 years. Never seen nothing like that before, and I've been putting in septic tanks for 20 years. What a way to end that with Amazing Grace. You know, there's nothing like being completely out of touch with what is actually going on around you. You may come away feeling rather elated or rather deeply moved or profoundly touched, only to find out you actually said nothing pertaining to what the people were there about. And it can often happen in talks such as these, or in conference especially, where ideas of truth are dealt with, that you can come away saying an awful lot and not getting to the nerve of what it is we really need to address. I hope I don't make that mistake. But my goal will be to get you thinking and to move you in the direction of trying to understand why we even are at a context like this. Why is it that we are in a setting here in the United States talking about tolerance? Maybe 15, 20 years ago, when the issues were being discussed hotly and debated, it sort of set the stage for where we were to get to in these matters. And now the divisions are rather deep. The sensitivities are right at the core, at the outer surface, and it is so easy to offend. And when you do something like that, it is never done with impunity. The cost can be very heavy when wrong things are said with a wrong motive or a wrong attitude, and especially at an academic arena such as this. So I hope I will do my best to at least get you to think in an area that I think is critical for understanding. I'm coming to this from a Christian viewpoint. I am a follower of Jesus Christ. I came to become a follower of him in my teenage years. I go back in my own background. My ancestors came from the highest caste of the Hindu priesthood. They were called the Nambudris from the deep south. In the middle of my teen years, I began a search because of the emptiness that was in my life. I was always in the minority, one way or the other. Christians are a minority in India, 2 to 3%. I was born in the south, raised in the north. There were a lot of sensitivities at that time, ranging all the way from color of skin to language and so on. When I was the age of 20, I moved to Canada. There were only 5,000 Indians in Toronto at that point. Today, there are 500,000 Indians in Toronto. The whole demographic situation has drastically changed. I'll never forget once getting off a plane in Paris when I was doing my graduate work in Chicago with 45 other students. I was the only non-Westerner in that group. So we got off the plane in Paris, and my professor, a renowned professor of philosophy and worldviews and so on, we got off the plane, and as we were going through the immigration there, the man looked at my passport, and it was from India. And he said, Indians need a visa to get in here. You don't have a visa. I said, well, I'm just with the group, sir. I thought I was here on a historic tour of Europe and so on and so forth. He said, no, we can't let you in. And the toughness that ensued for about 30 minutes as my professor tried to make a plea out of the 45 of us where one was told he could not enter. And finally, my professor did not succeed. For 2 days, I literally sat in the airport while the other 44 did a tour of Paris and the environs, and I had to wait till we got on the plane. And you know, when Tom Hanks did his movie, being situated in the airport, if he talked to me, I could have given him an awful lot of lines of what to do for about 48 hours. What do I do after that? Go back and stop buying everything French? Stop eating their cheese, stop talking about their cuisine, never walk into a French restaurant? Is that where you react? No, they were living with some laws. I was not aware of them. I'd not dealt with it correctly. I did what I was told to do, but ended up in that situation. And so you find yourself oftentimes on a fringe looking in from the outside. I was that way with life itself. I was not doing well in my studies, and in India, if you don't succeed in your studies, you're really living in a shame-oriented culture. So at the age of 17, I attempted to take my own life. And there I lay in a hospital bed, for the first time really cracking open a Bible on my own. And that's where my spiritual journey began. So as I talk to you tonight, I'm not talking sort of off the cuff. I'm not talking disconnected from the reality of a life that pursues meaning, or from coming from a minority background, a minority world. I'm coming to you, hopefully, interacting in a way that we can make sense out of our diversities and our differences and learn to live even with our disagreements. I want to trace for you what I see as the progenitors, the ideas that brought us to this point. And so what I'll do is I'll take an extended period of my talk to set up these three moods that came about, I believe, in the 1960s that were forever going to change the West, especially the United States. And then in the last moment, I'm going to hang a small piece of thought on these three pegs and tell you what the bottom line is on the struggle. I'll lay the groundwork, set up the backdrop, take you to an applicational mode, and after we finish with that, I will have my colleague Michael Ramsden join me, and we will do our best to answer your questions. Many years ago, Daniel Yankelevich, writing in Atlantic Monthly, was talking about the changes in American culture. And he quoted the sociologist Daniel Bell in defining what culture means. And he said this: culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. Notice again, please. It is an effort to find a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. But then he goes on to say this: a genuine cultural revolution is underway when it makes a decisive break from the shared meanings of the past. When it makes a decisive break from the shared meanings of the past, particularly those which relate to the deepest questions of the purpose and nature of human life. When it makes a decisive break with the shared meanings of the past. Culture, then, when it's looking to find a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that confront all of us in the passage of our lives, that coherence is sought. But it is assumed in that pursuit that we've got some shared meanings from the past. But a cultural revolution is underway when we make a decisive break from those shared meanings. And we made that break beginning in the 1960s. What were those breaks that were made? How did it all come about? The three moods that took effect. Number one was the mood called secularization. Secularization is the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. It is a process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. And since I was relatively new to the West in the 60s, I remember the battles that were raging at that time. The Cultural Revolution underway. Although I was living in the city of Toronto, Canada then, I could just see all the upheavals that were taking place. The volatile issue of that time that was being discussed was really on the sanctity of life and whether the person had the right to abort a baby or not to abort a baby. But in the backdrop was this horrific thing of the Vietnam War, and the young people totally fed up with all that was going on, and the upheaval actually began. But religious ideas then were losing their social significance. How would you have witnessed that? If you'd had people on a platform discussing some social issue and you had a university president, you had a lawyer, you had a medical doctor, you had a homemaker, you had people, experts in counseling and psychology and physiology and all of that, and you put a minister in the midst of that panel, you could be sure that if it were a moral issue, the audience would have concluded that the minister was the most prejudiced of the group. That everyone else was rather objective in their worldviews and so on, that the minister came with rather an agenda and a prejudicial worldview. The problem that began then has lingered and it has gone on. And religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations in the West have been marginalized to a point, if not evicted, where they have lost their social significance. What happens when things like that take shape? I recall reading some poets and some philosophers and some journalists who were beginning to talk about the things that were underway. One of my favorite writers at that time was a man by the name of Malcolm Muggeridge, and I remember Muggeridge's very profound words when he said this: "It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct. This was Muggeridge, one-time editor of Punch magazine, talking about how we had created boredom out of our own affluence, impotence out of erotomania, vulnerability out of strength, how we were blowing the trumpets to pull down our own cities, and how we were educating ourselves literally into imbecility, where we were pontificating on ideas not aware of the terrain into which we were literally headed. I think it was Huxley himself who said that the dangers that lay ahead of us was that with the increase in knowledge in science and all of that, he said knowledge would become a deadly friend if we did not know where to lay the rules and how to draw the boundary lines for all of these things. It was the English journalist Steve Turner who put it in this way, talking about the 60s and 70s. We now believe in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay, as long as you don't hurt anyone, to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that taboos are the only thing that are taboo. We believe that everything is getting better despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated, and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe there's something in UFOs, horoscopes, and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think some of his good morals were basically bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same, at least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes the nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end, and if the dead have lied, then it's compulsory heaven for all, excepting perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average, what's average is normal, what's normal is actually good. We believe in total disarmament. We believe there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors, and the Russians will be sure to follow. We believe that man is essentially good. It's only his behavior that lets him down. This is the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions. Conditions are the fault of society. We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him, and reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust. History will alter. We believe there is no absolute truth, except for the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the rejection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought. And then he puts this as a postscript. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshiping his maker. If chance is the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshiping his maker. Who would have ever thought that we are living today with dangers in areas that ought to have been the safest places in our towns? I remember being invited to Virginia Tech after that tragedy, to Colorado after the tragedy there and the shooting. And the day after the shooting in Newtown, we got a call wanting to know, could we come there and help people's lives, try to be put back together. If chance be the father of all flesh, that's the kind of worship you end up seeing expressed in such settings. What's the problem here? The problem, as I see, is not with secularization per se, because ultimately we really don't want a theocracy. We don't want a religious authority ruling the country. History is replete with pathetic examples of what happened when power was arrogated to those who, instead of representing God, started to play God. Wherever the church became a state church, the exploitation of the masses became horrendous, and the entire French Revolution, as the lid was tightened and tightened and tightened, as Robespierre and Voltaire began to react, when the lid was blown over, so went religion at the same time, because of how they had seen it as abused, and abused so many of its people at the core. Same thing happened in Germany prior to the Reformation. But if secularization comes to mean the eviction of the sacred in the public square, where it's not given a free chance at its discourse, that's when you run into the big problem of what I call necessary definitions. C.S. Lewis, for example, leads us in a solution here, but let me move back a little bit. In the 1980s, in the city of Atlanta, Georgia, where I make my home, there was a tremendous trial going on for one of the world's leading pornographers. His name was Larry Flynt. They said his stuff was so perverse that it actually made Playboy magazine stuff look tame. But Larry Flynt had a brilliant lawyer who had one goal in mind. He had a goal of erasing distinctions in the way he questioned the witnesses. So, first of all, it took them over 5 days to find the first member of the jury, because in order to be a member of the jury, Flynt's lawyer did not want you to belong to a church. If you belonged to a church, you could not qualify to be a fair juror in terms of making any judgment on pornography. They finally got that jury together. And when the witnesses were being questioned by Mr. Flynt's lawyer, he would ask them something like this: have you ever been into an art gallery? Yes, sir. Have you ever been into an art gallery where you had to pay to get into that? Yes, sir. Have you ever been into an art gallery where you've paid to get into it, where you've seen the paintings of undisrobed people by the great masters of art? Yes, sir. Would you please now explain to the jury why you believe that to be art and my client's stuff to be pornographic? And of course, on a witness stand, what are you going to say? You're going to get into a philosophy of art discussion? No, but if you're sitting at a table one-on-one with a lawyer, I thought to myself, if he gave me a chance to talk about this, I would probably have a tough time and would try to. I'm not a philosopher of art by any stretch of imagination, but I did study moralist philosophers and their reasoning and moral theory and so on. And so I would have said something to him like this: do you remember the story of Michelangelo when he began his paintings? And he started to paint disrobed people. His teacher one day looked at him and said, "Michael, why are you doing this?" He said, "Because I want to see man as God sees man." He said, "But you're not God." And a fascinating discussion followed. Point one, worthy of discussion. But point number two, C.S. Lewis's challenge here is so immense. It is something like this. In his philosophical journey to Christ, in an allegorical form, he tells it in the book A Pilgrim's Regress. The reason he calls it regress rather than progress, and this year, by the way, is the 50th anniversary death of C.S. Lewis. He died the same day that John Kennedy was shot. I think Aldous Huxley Lewis and John Kennedy died on the same day, 22nd November 1963. So 50 years have gone by since the death of that great apologist. But in his book, A Pilgrim's Regress, he talks about allegorically how this young man called John was searching for the truth, flirted for a long time with pantheism, and he turned his back upon it, didn't know precisely why. Came to humanism and atheism and the spirit of the age. Something made him terribly uncomfortable. It was only after he found his life in Christ, he said, he took a regressive journey because he had the answers for why it was he had turned away from the other options that were given to him. But at this point in his book, The Pilgrim's Regress, he's in a mountain called the Spirit of the Age, and he's sitting in front of the Neronic stare of he who heads up that mountain, staring down at its occupants, and Lewis pictures himself handcuffed, which is quite fascinating that a man in total liberty is actually allegorically portraying himself as handcuffed, enslaved. And the waiter comes representing the Spirit of the Age and serves him his breakfast, and he takes a drink of the milk and comments on how nourishing, nutritious it is. And when he finishes commenting on that, the waiter says, "You just call it nutritious, nourishing milk. All it is the secretion of a cow, isn't it? Like urine, milk. One is a secretion, is another secretion." John says, "I didn't know how to respond to this kind of nonsense that was coming, but I just let go." And he said, "Then I made the mistake of commenting on the nutritiousness of the eggs." He said, "Then you should have heard the analogy, and I won't repeat it for you." But as those analogies were drawn, and Lewis is sort of now squirming, having taken those eggs into his system and the milk into his system, and the waiter goes away, and then he says this, reason came riding on a horse and rescued me and said, you lie because you don't know the difference between what nature's meant for nourishment and what nature has meant for garbage. You don't know the difference between what nature's meant for nourishment and what nature has meant for refuse. You see, the man or the woman in front of the lens of a camera, whose body is being used purely to try to titillate the imagination or the fanciful thoughts of a man or woman in front of you there, in order to provoke just the baser instincts and ultimately leave you unsatisfied and insatiable, because what they are pandering to you is not a person. What they are enslaving you to is a feeling that no one person can ultimately satisfy. They are creating you in a hunger. The imagination is assaulted to the degree that no one human being has the capacity to fulfill this kind of a longing. And somebody in front of that camera ought to say, sir, don't do this to me. But ladies and gentlemen, here I think is the tragedy when secularism with a capital S has evicted everything that is sacred and made a free-for-all grab for sensation and feeling alone. It will ultimately eradicate a sense of shame within a culture. Shame is a desperately needed sensation when things are wrong deep within you. Do you know psychiatrists are dealing with the possibility of a medication for post-traumatic stress disorder for those who come back from the battlefield, to give them this morning after pill to help them to erase all the memory of all the trauma they went through? One of their greatest challenges, what if a rapist decides to take it the morning after a rape? What happens to the medication then to dispense it to somebody who can consider commit criminal acts and yet at the same time want to eradicate the entire memory? Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you, you show me a man or a woman or a culture without shame, and I will show you monstrosity in its making. I met a young man in Malaysia who had just escaped from Saddam Hussein's army. He had lunch with my wife and myself. He told me he was taught to do two things in Saddam's army. Number one, to build false passports, and number two, to kill without feelings. He said, I've become an animal. I have become an animal. How to kill without feelings. Secularization can ultimately eradicate shame. Secondly, the idea of pluralization. Pluralization is also a good thing. We must have a plurality of sounds, languages, cuisines, options, and ideas. Somebody told me of a Korean who has a fast food outlet selling kosher tacos here in Los Angeles. You talk about a born capitalist. He knows exactly what he's doing. When I arrived in Canada, there was only one Indian restaurant in Toronto, and that was a fake. When I sat down there, I said, this boy's either never been there or he thinks we've never been there. This is not Indian food. People often ask me why Indians die young, and I say because God needs the chefs for the marriage supper of the Lamb, so he's taking the Indians up first. You know, a mouthful of Indian food is the closest thing to ecstasy you will ever find. And so I go in there. I love the pluralistic society. I'm a product of a pluralistic culture. If Canada hadn't opened its doors to me and my family, there would never have been the possibilities that we have now enjoyed. Pluralization, defined ideologically, is where there's a competing number of worldviews available to its members and no one worldview is dominant. The important thing to know is that if that is the case, and it ought to be the case, it is very legitimate, but at the same time, if pluralism or pluralization is extrapolated to mean relativism, then we are on a deadly course again. I don't often tell this anymore. In the early days I did, so if it's familiar to some of you, you'll have to forgive me for it. But years ago when I was first starting out, I was in California, not far from here, and I was speaking at an open forum, presenting various ideas. And one professor from one of the nearby universities came up to me at the end of a talk with a packed auditorium, and he said to me, "So you're presenting a defense of Christianity?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'd like you to give a talk one night this week on why you are not a Hindu." So an American gentleman. I said, "Why do you want me to do that?" He said, "Because I've become a Hindu." I said, "So you want me to talk to you in front of the whole auditorium on why I'm not a Hindu?" He said, "No, I'll bring my whole class and we'll take you on." He was baiting me. I didn't bite. So I said, "You know, sir, I don't like to do things like that." I tried to cheer him up a bit. I said, "When you throw mud at others, not only do you lose a lot of ground, you're bound to get your hands dirty as well." He didn't think that was very funny. So he just looked at me and said, "Are you going to do it or not?" I said, "I tell you what, I'll make a deal with you. On the final night, I'm presenting my total defense of why I believe Jesus Christ is who he claimed to be. You bring your students and they can tear me apart then." It's all right, have it your way, I'll bring them. So he brought them and he sat, and I had to avoid looking in his direction because his body language is totally distracting me from my subject on hand. And at the end of it, he came up to me and he said to me, he said, "You know what?" He said, "You don't understand Hinduism." I said, "I don't?" He said, "No." He said, "No, you don't." He said, "If you understood it, you would never have said the things that you did about the kind of logic they use and this and that and all of that." I said, "I was basically talking about the logic of the law of non-contradiction and so on. Why do you even talk about my lack of understanding in it?" I said, "Look, I'm not trying to impress your students. Let's go out and have a bite. You pay, I'll pray, we'll have lunch. Let's go." So he said, "All right." And he said, "Can I bring the professor of psychology with me?" I said, "Is he going to study us or is he going to have a discussion with us?" He said, "No, I want a witness there." I said, "Okay." So he sat down, and while the psychologist and I enjoyed our meal, this boy hadn't put a morsel in his mouth. He'd just taken all the placemats from our table and every other table, and he was drawing out his argument. He was the professor of philosophy at the institution, fine American gentleman, and then he was drawing out this basic idea. He said, "Mr. Zacharias," he said, "there are two types of logic." Actually, that is wrong. There are many more, but you don't stop a person that soon. He said, there are two types of logic. He said, there is the either-or logic. The either-or logic. Either this or that. It's the law of non-contradiction. Either this proposition or not this proposition. And that is a Western way of thinking. I said, "No, it is not." He said, "Yes, it is." I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Yes, it is." I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Who are you to tell me no, it's not?" I said, "All right, continue." He said, "And then there is the dialectical system, a la Karl Marx, to try to find the classless society, not the owner or the employee, but you find both of them in that classless society, a la Hegel. The thesis spawns a antithesis, and you bring together for a synthesis, from a thesis to an antithesis to a synthesis. And that's how history moves in the dialectic. What Hegel had in his ideationalism, Marx took in his material theory, and he's giving me all this big talk, It's the both-and system. It's not either-or. And he said, it's an Eastern way of thinking. I said, "No, it is not." He said, "Yes, it is." I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Yes, it is." I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Why do you say these things?" So he went on to say, he said, "You see, Ravi, in the Eastern way of thinking, contradictions are not a problem. You can take two mutually exclusive statements and accept both of them. Your problem is you are studying philosophy like a Westerner with the either-or rather than an Easterner with the both-and. If you studied Eastern philosophy with the both-and, the contradictions wouldn't bother you. We'd all be believing the same thing." I said, "Are you finished now?" "Please have your lunch, sir," I said. "Enjoy it." I said, "I have only one question for you. What you're telling me is when I'm studying worldviews, I either use the both-and system or nothing else. Is that right?" I either use the both-and logic or nothing else. Is that right? The fork was to his mouth. He puts it down and he says, "The either-or does seem to emerge, doesn't it?" I said, "Yes, sir. In fact, I got some shocking news for you. Even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. It's either the bus or me, not both of us." I have a Hindu convert friend who's now my brother-in-law. He started laughing halfway through this argument. He said, that's why you're the apologist and I'm now a pastor. He actually used to be a nuclear physicist. He's a pastor now. He said, you see, if he'd said that to me, I would have said, there's both hand, all that you cracked up it to be. Why can't I use both the both hand and the either or? Why do I have just to use the both hand? Same idea. I said, you see, sir, what you've got wrong is this. Eastern philosophy also subscribes to the law of non-contradiction. What do you think Islam is all about if it didn't subscribe to the law of non-contradiction? I said, Shankaracharya, the greatest Hindu exponent who followed the Vedas, firmly believed in the law of non-contradiction. Gautama Buddha was born a Hindu and renounced that and moved into Buddhist philosophy to create his own Buddhist philosophy. Why, if the both hand could occur? Why did he move in that direction? See, ladies and gentlemen, contradiction is a very serious thing in ideas. It is ultimately deadly in life. You live in a contradictory way to philosophy, to truth, and you will find you'd pay the price in it. Listen to G.K. Chesterton in one of his writings. The new rebel is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty, therefore he can never be a true revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind. And the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. So he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel in which he insults it himself. He curses the Sultan because Christian girls lose their virginity, then curses Mrs. Grundy because they keep it. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life, and then as a philosopher that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. He calls the flag a bauble, then blames the oppressors of Poland or Ireland because they take away that bauble. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella, goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything. This contradictory way of thinking, you see, in secularism, if it leads to a society without shame, society cannot survive. In pluralization, if you abandon the law of non-contradiction, you ultimately lose your way in reason. Loss of shame, loss of reason, secularization and pluralization, which brings me to the third, privatization. And by the way, my work in Cambridge University was in the Romantic poets. I love poetry. I love to see how the poets oftentimes grapple with reality much more than those who do merely as philosophers or in prose. I had a wonderful time yesterday with your great Professor Lowenstein, and we were talking his love for literature and law, of course, and my love for literature and philosophy. We had a great conversation talking about the poets and the great writers in literature and so on. But I remember the rock group in the 70s, I think King Crimson rock group, they wrote something like this: Cat's Foot, Iron Claw, neurosurgeons scream for more, from paranoia's poison door, 21st century schizoid man. Blood rack, barbed wire, politicians, funeral pyre, innocents raped with napalm fire, 21st century schizoid man. Death seed, blind man's greed, poets starving, children bleed, nothing he's got, he really needs, 21st century schizoid man. Take a note now. The walls on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams. Upon the instruments of death, the sunlight brightly gleams. Will no one lay the laurel wreath as silence drowns the screams? Between the iron gates of fate, the seeds of time are sown and watered by the deeds of those who know and who are known. Knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind, I see, is in the hands of fools. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. If we make it, we can all sit back and laugh, but I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying. no reason, no shame. Privatization leads you ultimately where you are compelled in your spirit to sever your ties with your deepest commitment of the soul and relegate it to the private world. You daren't bring it into the public world. If you'd told me 40 years ago that the America of today would be here the way it is, I would never have believed it. I've just flown in from Bangkok, Thailand 2 days ago. I use a little apartment there where I write my books. And as I arrived late at night all by myself, and the security guy takes me to the elevator and he presses the button and the doors close, I look at a wall. May you know the joys of Christ this Christmas. And may you have a blessed New Year, Thailand. They are 98% Buddhists. Years ago, I remember arriving in Beijing and going into the Forbidden City on a cold January day. It was the first week of January. I walked and walked. You go through, I think, 7 portals. And all of a sudden, past the 7th portal, in the Forbidden City in Beijing, just past Tiananmen Square, you walked in there, and as I walked past that last portal, Starbucks. And a sign outside Starbucks, Merry Christmas. Try that here these days. You can walk through Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Delhi, in the malls, and hear the carols. You try playing a carol in a school here, and the American Civil Liberties Union will be after you. Last year, in one school in New Jersey, they prohibited even the instrumental versions of Christmas carols because the children knew the words, and the words would be triggered in their mind, which would bring religious thoughts into their thinking. Come on. Tolerance? Is it that intimidating? If I look at a man who is a Muslim man and I said to him, you know, hope your Ramadan is going well to you. I wish you a good Ramadan these days. Am I succumbing to his faith? Is it that hard to wish people a Merry Christmas? So even Thanksgiving is now Turkey Day, which may be more reflective of what's becoming of us rather than what the season is really all about. What's happened? To take away that which is the sacred most thing within your heart and relegate it to the private world. Do you know what happens then? You end up without meaning. This is the single expression of our time. When I was 17 and tried to take my own life, I was not independent in my thinking. There were many others who were in the same category. And I traveled through the campuses all over the globe, and I find young people coming and telling me the same thing, struggling with meaning, trying to make sense out of it. This morning I had 45 minutes with a man who's a complete skeptic. It doesn't all make sense, says he. It doesn't all make sense. In the spiritual world, in the world of your faith and your belief, your connectedness in the deepest confines of your soul, if they are relegated only to the private, it is an amputation and breaks away your connection with meaning. Secularization, no shame. Pluralization, no reason. Privatization, no meaning. Can I take the consequences and anchor it for you now? It is this. Cultures ultimately reduce themselves to 3 forms of manifestation on moral issues. Based on this backdrop, three forms. I want you to follow me carefully. The words are big, but the ideas will become clear. I think Paul Tillich was the first one who talked about in these terms. There are 3 kinds of culture: theonomous, heteronymous, and autonomous. Theonomous, not a theocracy. Theos meaning God, nomos meaning law. The idea in a theonomous culture is that God's law is so self-evident within the human heart that there are some imperatives within you that find a consensus in society. That's God's law in you, the nomos, the law of the theos, God, is so ingrained in your soul that there is an emerging consensus within society of certain norms that everyone agrees in are noble, or the opposite of them being evil and not to be pursued. If there is a culture today that comes close to a theonomous culture, I would say it is India. They refer to themselves in Hindi as Dharti ke Aadmi, the people of the soil. Their music talks about it, their lyricists talk about it, their poetry talks about it. The values that the culture tries to hold on to, principally respect for the parents, love for the children, the transmission from generation to generation, the closeness of the family tie, all of those values they consider ingrained within them. They say it's deep within them. There's a theonomous nature to it. It's not identical, but it's close to a theonomous culture. But then you get a heteronymous culture. What is a heteronymous culture? Heteros meaning different, nomos law, a different law, where there are two distinct sets in operation. There's the controlling few and the masses down here. In secular terminology, Marxism is a heteronymous culture, where the handful at the top dictate everything for the masses below. In religious terms, Islam functions as a heteronymous culture. Either the ulama or the imam or whoever, the dictates are given to you from above, and the masses are then told to follow along. There is a heteronomy to it. The law comes from above, dictated to the masses, whether you want to do it or not. And then there's an autonomous culture. The autonomous culture, autos meaning self, nomos meaning law. You're a self-law. You're a law unto yourself. You follow your individual autonomy. America would not fit into a theonomous culture. It would not fit into a heteronymous culture by definition. We pride ourselves in the fact that we are an autonomous culture. So here's the question. If we are an autonomous culture, do we respect the autonomy of each individual? If I respect the person who disagrees with me and wants to live a totally materialistic life, ought not that compliment to be returned and give me the privilege of having my autonomy and my choice to follow God and my choice to follow where I believe the truth has led? Autonomous cultures pride themselves in being self-driven and individually driven. But I'll tell you what, there are some questions that bait the hook. Will turn the questions towards people like me or others, force us to answer it under the guise of an autonomous culture. But the moment my view is not in keeping with the view that wants to be heard, it's switched into a heteronymous culture, and I'm dictated to and told this is exactly what I need to believe and not what I actually believe. This bait and switch that has taken place is striking, absolutely striking. So we don't go with the theonomous culture here. We don't go with the heteronymous culture. We claim to go with an autonomous culture, but autonomous cultures need to be mutually respectful. And I think what the Duke of Edinburgh once said, he said, freedom can be destroyed not only by its retraction, but also by its abuse. And so I'll leave you with two thoughts. In the first one, I'll do a little bit of a voice play here, not in any way to be unkind, but because it was so beautiful and so sweet, so sweetly done. In the 1980s, when the Cold War was still on, my wife, a couple colleagues, and I were invited to go to Russia. So we're in Moscow. Quite a cold day, foggy day, and we went in. My host said, "Would you like to have lunch?" I said, "Sure." So we had lunch, and things were pretty sparse then. Everything was a different consistency of mayonnaise. Mayonnaise bound this, mayonnaise bound that. Mayonnaise may just make you feel full. But you know, people were struggling. You looked at the empty shelves and you said, what are we to mock that? So the waitress was a lovely Russian gal, bilingual, and she spoke in a sweet voice, and we finished our lunch, and then she leaned over very nicely and said, "Would you like to have some dessert?" So my host said, "Well, things have changed. We can also have dessert." I said, "Oh, that'll be lovely. What do you have?" She said, "Ice cream." We said, "What else?" "Ice cream." I said, "Oh, okay. Yeah, we'd like to have some ice cream. What flavor would you like?" We said, "What flavor do you have?" "Vanilla." We said, "Any other flavor?" "No, vanilla." So the man on the left said, "Would you like to have vanilla ice cream for dessert?" I said, "Yes, we would." He said, you know the genius? She actually walked away from here thinking she gave you a choice of desserts. That's what this game of tolerance can become. We're actually given the idea that we have a choice. Is it true? It ought to be true. And that's why Os Guinness is right. He thinks civility is a better word than tolerance, where you may learn to accept what another person believes, but you don't have to celebrate it, and in civil manner, you disagree. A cartoon I saw years ago with Dennis the Menace sitting in front of his lemonade stand. Sign, all you can drink for 10 cents. So a little guy stops and puts up his 10 cents, and Dennis the Menace takes the glass and pours a wee little bit into his glass and gives it to him. In the next frame of the cartoon, he's looking bewildered, saying, what? You know, in the third frame of the cartoon, Dennis is saying, I says it's all you can drink for 10 cents. That's who says it's all you can drink for 10 cents. Is that what tolerance is becoming? We tell you what it all means. That's who tells you what it all really means. I hope not. Daniel Yankeliewicz's article ended by the survey of many American couples, and he ended by saying the stakes are high. If you feel it is imperative to fill all your needs, and if these needs are contradictory or in conflict with those of others or simply unfillable, then frustration inevitably follows. To Abby and to Mark as well, self-fulfillment means having a career, having a career and marriage and children and sexual freedom and autonomy and being liberal and having money and choosing nonconformity and insisting on social justice and enjoying city life and country living and simplicity and graciousness and reading and good friends and on and on. But the individual is not truly fulfilled by becoming ever more autonomous. Indeed, to move too far in this direction is to risk psychosis, the ultimate form of autonomy. The injunction that to find oneself, one must lose oneself, contains a truth any seeker of self-fulfillment needs to grasp. The injunction that to find oneself, one must lose oneself, contains a truth any seeker of self-fulfillment needs to grasp. I could have saved him millions of dollars of research if he'd read the Gospel of John. That if any man come unto me, can deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. There was a man in Pakistan, a medical doctor, who became a devout follower of Jesus Christ. We were telling our stories to each other. I said to him, what happened? He told me the long story from whence he had come, what happened, and the transformation that happened in his life when he began to follow Christ. He said, Ravi Ji, a respectful term within our language. This gentleman's from Pakistan, so he spoke Hindi, Urdu, and all of that. He said, Ravi Ji, I was a hostile skeptic. I hated anything about anyone that claimed the truth. He said, in the closing sentence of this message that I had to listen to because my wife took me there, the man speaking said, in surrendering, you win. In dying, you live. In surrendering, you win. In dying, you live. Christ invites us to ultimately die to ourselves, to find out the beauty of the real self he has made in you and me, and make that beautiful person who learns to live even in a contrary society, shining a light in a dark world. If you told me at the age of 17 that that would be my calling in life, I would never have believed it. But what God did in transforming my heart, in changing my hungers, in making me the person he wanted me to be, I have not looked back over these decades and found the fulfillment and joy and meaning, and consider it a great privilege to be living in America now and having the opportunity to raise my family here, to make a living, and to be able to share the love of Christ wherever we go. And I thank you at UCLA for giving me this opportunity. God bless you.
At this time, Dr. Zacharias, would you like to introduce Dr. Ramsden?
It's a real honor for me to have Michael Ramsden come all the way from Oxford. He just landed about 1:30 this afternoon. Michael is a professor there and my colleague at work. He heads up work all across Europe. When I first met him, he was in his early 20s. He remained in his early 20s for many years after that because we never quite knew when the years were changing. Michael is one of the most gifted communicators in the world today. I mean that. He's a man with immense intellect, an extraordinary sense of humor, married to his wife Anne with 4 beautiful children. And Michael has his family in Oxford and travels the globe with me, hither and yon. And as he travels, he's speaking at many times to the European Parliament, many times to the House of Lords members and so on. He did his PhD work at the University of Sheffield in international monetary law and actually lectured in philosophy at Sheffield for some time too. Our friendship goes back over many, many years now, and we've been working together for about 15 to 16 years. And I just wanted Michael to come and join us. That gives me a break in the Q&A time. We will alternate these. You will enjoy listening to him. Actually, he should have been doing the speaking, and I should have come afterwards. He's better looking than I am, not for long, but he will be like that for some time. Come on in, Michael. Yeah.
At this time, those who wish to ask questions may make their way to the microphones here at the front. As they do so, I will start off the Q&A by reading our first text-in question. This question is for Dr. Zacharias. Why did you try to end your life at 17? What about Christ made you want to live on?
Can I do it from here? The microphone's on right here, right? Okay. I told the story in my book, Walking from East to West. It was one of the most difficult books I ever wrote because I wrote it as really my own personal journey. My dad, highly placed individual in the government of India and the Home Ministry, very successful. He was a tough man, tough-tempered, tough in every sense of the term. Extremely disciplined to have gotten to where he did. He'd done his work in industrial relations at the University of Nottingham, came back quite highly placed and influential. And out of us 5 brothers and sisters, I was the most underperforming individual. I never made it through anything. I lived for 2 things. I lived for the cricket field. I lived for the tennis court. I wanted to play cricket. I dreamed about cricket, I drooled about cricket, I imagined cricket, and now here am I all these years, having left India 4 decades ago, I still dream about cricket. I enjoy the game so much. It's a beautiful game, really a beautiful game. With the result, I concentrated very little on my studies. My life could be described as punctuated failure. That's what it was, punctuated failure. And in my book, I tell the story one day of taking the most severe thrashing from my dad. It's the way they knew how to do it. It was the time and culture in which they felt this is how they change you. I'm not blaming him. I'm just telling you it's the way it was. If my mother hadn't intervened, I think some bones would have been broken. The results would have been very costly. I was a very slender kid, small kid, and my dad really took it out on me that day. And the more I pondered this, I thought to myself, why? What's all this about anyway? You know, if you don't like the way you feel, why do you want to keep on feeling? And if I could describe it in one sentence, I really didn't want to feel anymore. Because what I felt, I didn't like. And I took from the science labs some poisons and tried to end it all. Very, very nearly succeeded. I mentioned the fact that in India this happens quite often. My closest friend had doused himself with kerosene and burned himself to death because he had not succeeded in the exam. We live with that tension. Things are slightly changed, but the most suicide-rich time of the year is when the results are out at universities. When I came to know Christ, I wanted to put life together. There are 4 questions in life for all of us: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Where do I come from? What gives life meaning? How do I differentiate between good and bad? What happens to a human being when he or she dies? Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. You have to find answers that are correspondingly true to each of these questions, and all put together, it has to cohere. There has to be coherence in this. There has to be a skin that pulls it all together. In reading John's Gospel, I couldn't read it actually. The gentleman who brought the Bible to me lives about 10 miles from here, but he himself is very close to the end of his life. I wanted so much to bring him here. I spoke to him on the phone about 2 months ago. He said, please let me come, but his situation is so weak right now. And he often said to me, on the phone he said to me that day, just after Christmas, he said, sometimes I think I came into this world just to be able to give you a Bible. Just to be able to give you a Bible. And that transformed my life as I walked out of there. John chapter 14 was read to me. Jesus said, because I live, you shall live also. If I can take a tail ender to this, Jesus said, because I live, you shall live also. I knew it wasn't biological life. I trusted in him with the little prayer that I prayed and walked out of there and followed up with it with men and women who could teach me the scriptures, and life changed. One by one, the rest of the family, including my father, mother, all became followers of Christ. Even though we'd come from a priestly background, we'd lost the message of Christ somewhere along the way. When my mother died in her 50s, my dad asked me if I would preach at her funeral in Toronto. I struggled with it. Then he said at the graveside, he said, son, what would you want to put on her gravestone? I said, add the verse that she first read to me without even knowing what it meant. So he put John 14:19. Jesus said, because I live, you shall live also. That was in 1974. In the 1990s, my wife and I, my wife's from Canada, went into Delhi. She said, can I see your grandmother's grave? You talk so much about remembering as a little boy going to that funeral. I said, honey, I don't know if you can find it. I tracked it down, went to the only Christian cemetery in Delhi, went to the registrar, found the register, tracked it down, found out I was only 9 years old in the mid-50s when she had passed away. Walked over to the plot, there was nothing visible. I hired a gardener with a shovel. I said, I'll be happy to pay you, please dig this soil and find the stone. So he's digging and digging and digging, and all of a sudden he strikes a stone. So he's gently moving it away, pouring water, moving it away, pouring water. And all of a sudden the words begin to emerge. The name of my grandmother, the date of her birth, date of her death, and then these words. Jesus said, because I live, you shall live also, John 14:19. The verse that brought me to him, that's on my mother's grave, was originally put on my grandmother's grave about something about which none of us as a family actually knew. The threads all came together. When Jesus came into my life, he didn't change what I did, merely he changed what I want to do. And I must tell you, because my father, if he were here, would tell me, he passed away, he said, tell him this truth too. I left from the bottom of the class to the top of the class after I came to know Christ and never left the top. Prior to that, my father used to say, center forward in football and fullback in studies. He never said that afterwards, so that's part of the story, yeah.
At the far microphone? Yeah, go ahead.
Is this thing on? Oh, there we go. All right. Thank you very much for being here. I'm a longtime listener, big fan of both of your work, rather your ministry. Thank you very much. Back to the topic of intolerance. I wonder if you care to discuss intolerance on the personal level versus intolerance on like the institutional level, because it seems that intolerance on the personal level, it's like, oh, okay, you know, I can walk away and I won't see that person again, and that's that. But when it gets into the institutions, whatever that may be, whether it's, you know, the local Rotary Club or the government or anything like that, you know, quite a hierarchy. Just wonder if you care to discuss that a little bit.
I was going to ask Michael to say something on that, but I'll save something tougher for him. Yes, and I think, and Michael, please feel free to pitch in here. My response would be fairly brief on that. I have found no better way than to sit down with the people. Institutions, evil does not run through the heart of institutions, it runs through the heart of people, men and women. It doesn't go through states or governments or organizations, it runs through the heart of every man and every woman. If I find somehow that there is something dishonorable here, I'll sit down and talk to the individual. Go and see the powers that be. The best you can do is voice and say, look, this is what's happening. I don't think this is right. I don't think this is fair. If the reverse were done, I don't think you would tolerate it very much either. So I ask you, sir or ma'am, would you please consider looking into this subject and changing the reality for us who feel victimized by an institutional pattern here? and I'll be most grateful to you. Thank you for just giving me these few minutes of talking to you. You build that relationship gradually, but you never do it by lawlessness or anarchy or rudeness or disrespect. You do it by drawing the best instincts out of people. And I have found some of the toughest of them change just by a period of relationship. Whenever I go into and stay in any hotel where I go to a race, I'll always go and ask to meet the manager. I'll go and meet the front desk person. I'll go and meet the maitre d', introduce myself. I say I'm here for the week. I look forward to enjoying this hotel and so on. And you know what? Through the middle of the week, they'll come to you and ask you if there's anything they can do, anything they can serve you in. It works that way even in institutions. Befriend the powers that be, and you'll be surprised how some of them will open up and say, even though this is not what I would like to do, I respect for you, I will do it. This gets more serious in academic subjects, theses, dissertations. You can find yourself being marked out because you're not sharing the ideas that one wants to share. You just have to be wise how you move in this and endure the tedious journey, and you do it in an honorable way. In the end, you will find truth will win out. Thank you.
Dr. Ramsden, would you have anything to add?
I mean, I may have been interpreting your question slightly differently, but when it comes to tolerance at an institutional level, I think, I know certainly in Europe we've got ourselves in a little bit of a confusion here. I got a letter from the British Home Office, which is it used to be called the Home Office, which deals with justice. Part of its things in the British political system, it looks after the police force, it looks after the law courts. And they used to have a little motto that said, building a free, just, and tolerant society. And I can remember the first time seeing that logo thinking, I have a feeling that only 2 out of these 3 are possible. And let me just explain to you what I mean by that. The word tolerance has come to be defined today, we're not quite sure exactly what it means. Either it means, well, we just accept and agree with everybody. But historically, that wouldn't be right. And in the past, when you talked about tolerating someone, the first thing you're assuming is you disagree with them. Because you don't tolerate what you agree with, right? I mean, if you agree with someone, you're not tolerating them, you're agreeing with them. But if you disagree with them, then you're actually passing judgment. No, I think what you're saying is wrong, and that could be morally or intellectually or whatever way, but you feel that it's important for you to allow that other position, even though you personally disagree with it. But when you talk about justice, and justice being upheld and enforced in a society, you're not normally asking for tolerance to be exercised. So in a rape case that's argued before a judge, for a judge to rule at the end of the rape case, well, we caught the guy and he's definitely guilty, but you know, we just have to tolerate these kinds of things. They just happen. And we've had laws against rape for hundreds of years, and we've never eradicated it, so we just have to learn to deal with it. At that point, we have it would seem to me a contradiction potentially there, which I think most people would instantly react against. The other problem we also have with tolerance is most of us think of it positively today. Tolerance is a good thing, even though most of us actually define it negatively. So, I mean, I'm only in LA just for a very short time. So I arrive this afternoon, I leave tomorrow morning, and then I'm going to Cairo, which will probably be my last speaking engagement this year. And so just imagine you hear that I'm just briefly in town, you come to me and say, Michael, you're only in LA just for a few hours and would like to extend some hospitality to you. Let me take you to the very best restaurant here in LA, and obviously for that kind of invitation, I'd extend my sleeping hours beyond. It's now 5 a.m. in England. I mean, I'll be happy to actually we can have breakfast together. And I accept your kind invitation, and the next morning, you hear me talking to a friend of yours, you're standing behind me, I can't see you, and your friend says to me, I hear someone took you out to LA's nicest restaurant last night. Did you enjoy meeting them? And I say, yeah, they were tolerable. If you heard that, would you be happy? They say, did you enjoy the food? And I say, I could tolerate it. It's very interesting. We talk about tolerance, but I know very few people in this world who want to be tolerated, but I know a lot of people who want to be respected. But here's the key thing, because I said the idea of tolerance, freedom, and justice, maybe only two of those are possible. I'm not sure, in that sense, our common acceptance of the definition of tolerance today is even compatible with freedom. In the sense that if that is the way we're now going to take tolerance, we just simply accept what anyone says, we need to understand, therefore, that's also the end of all free society and all free discussion. Because you cannot tolerate someone and disagree with them. Because at the point of disagreement, if it just does mean acceptance, you're no longer tolerating them. But you can respect someone and disagree with them. And since the means by which we find to be able to disagree with one another over certain issues becomes foundational to all civilized society, I'm wondering whether at times, rather than having huge debates about what tolerance is or isn't, we should begin to ask what actually does it mean to treat other people with respect. Because I desperately want to live in a society where we learn to respect one another as individuals, even though we may disagree at certain at the level of ideas. There you go, I'm going to sleep now.
We'll take another live question over at the other microphone.
This question is for both speakers. If the transformative power of Jesus Christ is so great and it's the only way to live an abundant life and to never thirst again, how come we do not see more Christians living this transformed, abundant, spirit-filled life? Please.
That's a really good question. If you would like to give me a list of names and addresses of all the hypocrites you know, I will be happy to go and pay some visits. I think your question is a very fair one. I think, as a matter of fact, I think it's more than fair. I want to be careful how I phrase this, because I'm part of the church. That's part of my identity. Ever since I myself became a Christian. But it does seem that the Bible has some very challenging words for the church. And as a matter of fact, just before coming up here, I was just reading through a speech that Dr. Martin Luther King gave. Is that right?
That's right.
And sorry, I'm in America, right? So I'm in the right country. Just checking. And when he was put in prison, he very famously wrote a letter from prison, which is a very impressive letter to read, his letter from Birmingham jail. All the more impressive when you remember he wrote that letter from memory. And I always knew he was a political activist, and I knew various things about him. I had no idea how well read he was. And you can always tell something about someone when they're writing a letter and they're making reference both to philosophy and to law and to theology. And he does it so well. But part of his letter, and I think it's something that needs to be heard today, is he says, we're living in America where the church is espousing one thing with its lips, but it's not living it with its life. He says, and therefore, he says, we are breeding a generation of people who've absolutely lost faith in the church, many of them losing faith in America as a country. And he shudders to think of the violence it may hold and the division it may cause in the United States of America as it went forward from that point. And he ends his letter with the words along the lines of, and now God's judgment rests on the church as never before. And I pray it may raise up in this decisive hour, and its voice may be heard. And what's more importantly, that it may actually live the moral values which it espouses. And so I think there has to be a challenge, and I think the Scripture is very challenging to Christians about the way in which we live, and the means by which we live, and the values by which we live. And I'm going to have to confess that I think in the Western church, we've excused ourselves from a lot of that, and we've claimed comfort and convenience as being the highest ethic, rather than the principle of laying down your life in service for others. We're expecting everyone to lay down their lives in service to us, and that can't possibly be right. I think Raviji would probably agree with us and say, I know my experience is when I'm visiting when I'm with the church in very poor parts of the world, when I'm visiting the church in parts of the world where you can be killed for simply becoming a Christian, the church I meet there is often very beautiful, very attractive, very humble, and very clear, both in its message and in its lifestyle. But our affluence seems to have choked the purity of that message. And so I think we need, if you like, a challenge to the church. And if you are a Christian here today, I think maybe one of the challenges, since we're talking about tolerance, would be that we are called to live a thoroughly uncompromised life. Now, it's maybe sad that when most people in this room, if you were to close your eyes and imagine a thoroughly uncompromised Christian, someone who was totally uncompromising in their Christian faith, we would immediately think of someone who was very harsh, very difficult, and very unpleasant to spend time with. But the Bible invites us to pass judgment on everyone who claims to be a Christian. And part of that judgment, we're told, is to look at the fruit of their life. And the fruit of their life, we're told, for everyone who claims to follow Christ should be love, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, and so on. So let's be thoroughly uncompromising about that. Let's just make sure that in no area of our life are we compromised in such that our lives are sending a message that will be inconsistent with the fruit that we're told to bear as Christians. So I think we may need to fall in love all over again with what it actually means to be a Christian, if you indeed are. And if you're not a Christian, if you've been put off by Christians, please don't reject the possibility of genuine life change and what it genuinely means to follow him, because you've encountered a few fakes. And it seems, especially in America, there's a lot of money to be made by faking it. Indeed, one friend I know who was training for the ministry said here, people will give a lot of money to authenticity, and if you can fake that, you've got it made. And maybe we just need to be maybe a little bit more, I think we do need to be more challenging with ourselves and also as members of the church, with the church, to say, does this look like Jesus said it should look like?
We have a lot of people lined up at the microphone, so I think we'll just try to keep things moving and answer as many questions as we can. Over at the other microphone.
Great. Well, I'd first like to thank both of you. I came here today on a whim, and I'm certainly glad I did. So this question is focusing on Dr. Zacharias' talk today, but you're both certainly welcome to answer. As I understand it, and I hope that this hasn't been too reductionist of me, you've noticed three main trends, those focusing on secularism, pluralism, and privatization. And the one that I find particularly interesting is the role between secularism and a loss of shame in society and the implications that could have. Where I guess I see the most tenuous link is the possibility of totally secular societies or a faithless society still having a shame culture, still having a moral basis from some other foundation of moral understanding. I'd just like to hear from both of you what role you think faith has, what role the church has in maintaining morality, and if there is the possibility for that still like moral reasoning in the absence of faith.
Again, it's a great question. The most important word, I think, that we need to bear in mind is that the word sacred ought to define what morality means. Because Jesus Christ really did not come into this world to make bad people good. He came into this world to make dead people live. Moral rectitude and moral uprightness can be held by many, but if a person in themselves think, I'm morally so good that I really don't need God, it's the most seductive form of morality, which ultimately leads you into some kind of arrogance or self-aggrandizement. I remember yesterday, Professor Lowenstein and I, when we were in conversation, he made the comment that humility is the characteristic he sees so lacking in our society right now. And when you're humble before God, you recognize the need to be transformed. You recognize the need that you cannot pull yourself on. You're up by your own moral bootstraps. Every major religion of the world I want you to hear me clearly now. Every major religion of the world is a works religion. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Sikhism, Baha'ism, Jainism, all of them. You can take every one of them, it has to do with works. In Islam, your entrance into paradise is dictated by your good deeds outweighing your bad deeds. In Hinduism, every birth is a rebirth, and it's on the basis of karma, all that went on before. And your karmic cycle keeps going till you can break off this cycle and attain nirvana or moksha or whatever they want to call it. In the Christian faith, you first of all come not by virtue of moral capacity. You come by the gift and the grace of God, who offers you forgiveness, and you come just as you are in all of your failings. When the prodigal son comes home in that tremendous parable, it is so counterintuitive within Eastern culture. This boy took the father's money, spent it at a whim, plundered his life, did everything wrong, and he's gone. And now he decides he's going to come home. In Eastern culture, the father would never go out. He's been wronged. He would have to wait till the son came and literally threw himself at his feet and begged for mercy. But in the way Jesus tells the story, the Eastern father would have immediately sort of perked up his ears. The father leaves the porch, leaves the home, runs towards the son, and embraces him and receives him. This my son was lost, is found, was dead, is alive. So morality is good living, is the fruit of your conversion and your commitment to Christ. It is not the means of your attaining salvation and attaining rightness in the sight of God. So what are the Ten Commandments all about? They were all about the fact that life is sacred, your word is sacred, your marriage is sacred, your time is sacred, your giving is sacred. And in the sanctity of life, these expressions come. But the Ten Commandments came after the Exodus. Redemption precedes righteousness. It is never the other way around. So God takes a life, puts that life back together, and gives you the fruit of what Michael was talking about. What does the church have to do here? I think the church has to teach us that that inner transformation is desperately needed. Let me say this very carefully. Listen to me carefully now. Malcolm Muggeridge said, "The depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable fact at the same time that it is the most intellectually resisted." The depravity of man is the most empirically verifiable fact, at the same time it's most intellectually resisted. If a man is stealing nuts and bolts from a railway track, says D.L. Moody, and you send him to university, at the end of his education, he will steal the whole railway track. Some of the biggest crimes that have been committed against humanity sometimes have been committed by high officers and high success stories. Depravity is here. Transformation, redemption, righteousness, and worship. That's the sequence. Morality alone will never get any one of us anywhere. It may make for some kind of existence, but it doesn't deal with the root of the problem, which is the rebellious heart that needs to be corrected and the heart that needs to humble itself before God. That's my word to you.
Dr. Ramsden, a word or?
Well, no, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, and I think when morality is used, especially in a legislative manner to enforce conformity, we've often missed the point. The question has to come, is it actually possible to see transformation from within and a new hunger and a new desire? If that is true, at that point, what the morality is doing is governing the nature of your relationships, as opposed to just simply being something which you feel compelled to do. Because all relationships are morally governed. You can't be in friendship with someone you don't trust. And the friends are those who you feel are committed to you, and you understand that commitment to you in moral terms, in terms of their faithfulness and their goodness to you and all those kinds of things. And so we need to bring some of that back, I think, into the vocabulary, as Dr. Zacharias has been saying.
Great. We'll take another text-in question at this time. This question is for both Dr. Zacharias and Dr. Ramsden. What do you say to those who cannot believe in God because suffering exists, and cannot believe that a good God would allow suffering?
I'd say that's a very good question. Well, maybe just a couple of things, because that's the kind of question that actually demands a very long answer. It might be the case for some people that when suffering comes, it's not simply the case that it may drive them away from God per se. It may simply be a catalyst that reveals to them what they actually thought about God in the first place. So if you find yourself caught up in suffering, you may, for some people, they'll find themselves driven into the arms of God because they believe He's there and He cares, and to others to walk away from the idea of God because they believe either He isn't there or He doesn't care. And so sometimes suffering simply acts as that catalyst. Let me suggest 3 possible things to turn to if you're interested. One of my colleagues, Vince Vitale, who is at Oxford, who's a philosopher who teaches with us, has done his whole doctorate on suffering. And he gave a very brilliant talk on the nature of suffering at Oxford University, in quite a hostile setting, and handled Q&A. It's available online, and I'm sure if you got in contact with our ministry at rzim.org, we could give you the link. Another one of my colleagues, also at Oxford, who's a professor of mathematics, was speaking down in New Zealand shortly after the earthquake there, which devastated the city. He stood in a ruined building, addressing people who'd all lost family members in that great tragedy, and tried to address the problem there on ground zero. And I also know that Dr. Zacharias is also all the way back to the time when you were in Columbine High School. I know there was a whole series of talks recorded there, one of which was simply why. So I think I'll try to say 2 things. I'd like to try to say that there's some hope, not just simply existentially in terms of finding comfort with God, but maybe even coming to know that there is God through it. And if you're interested, that question itself probably deserves a much longer answer that could simply be stated here. And if that is your question, you happen to be here, I'm sure we'll be happy to put you in contact with the resources. I think we can make you a promise and say if you're not a Christian and you are wrestling with this issue, then we would like to give you those resources for free. If you are a Christian and you want those resources, you may be tempted to have a small crisis of faith right now. And claim those resources for free, and to you, we'd just like to remind you there will be a day of judgment and accountability. So those aren't for you.
Well, Michael, I'll take 2 quick stabs at that. Michael was an answer to prayer for long suffering for many, many years, yeah. We travel together and he keeps us all entertained. His wife has only 2 words all the time while we travel. It's, "Oh, Michael, oh, Michael." And there he comes one after another. There's 2 sides to that question. Let me just defang it philosophically and then move quickly to the application. Vince and I are in the process of writing a book together on this. He's just sent me an outline, so that's what I was doing actually last week, Bangkok Take, doing my 3-chapter share of that. Philosophically, it's often, of course, put in tandem with evil. Suffering, evil. Suffering, evil. Why does God even allow evil? And I've often responded that it's very critical to understand the nature of the question, because when we say there's evil, we assume there's good. When we say there's good, we assume there's a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. When we assume a moral law, we assume a moral lawgiver. Because without the moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. Without the moral law, there's no good. Without good, there's no evil. The question actually ends up hoisting itself on its own petard, as it were. It doesn't know how to defend itself. But here's the killer point of that argument. Somebody may say, why do you need a moral lawgiver to have a moral law? And the answer is very clear in this. Every question raised about evil and suffering is either raised by a person or about a person, which means personal worth is essential to the question. Intrinsic worth is essential to the question. And in a naturalistic framework, you cannot have intrinsic worth. You've got extrinsic worth. It's conveyed to you. You're just a radar blip on the radar screen of time. You just happen to be here. But if you're a person created in the image of God with intrinsic worth, then the question indeed is reflective of the value that you give to personhood. So two things, the reality of good and the intrinsic worth of a person are essential to the question. If the question is to be taken seriously, those two assumptions need to be made, which the Christian makes. But the 2 points of application I want to make is this. You know, I've lived with serious back problems. That's why it's easier for me to stand also, not just keep seated. With 2 metal rods in my back and 8 screws bolting me down from L3 to S1 from a back injury that I suffered. I've had perfect health in every other way. 40 years of travel, I've never had an upset stomach in 40 years in 70 different countries. No issues of any kind. Those things don't bother me. Yeah, I was raised on the streets of Delhi. My mother said he ate everything, and nothing ever bothered him. There was a kind of place where if you went to eat and you spit in the sink afterwards, somebody would tell you, you went to a distinguished restaurant and did that, what would they tell you? You would tell them, I did go there, and they told me if I wanted to do that, to come here. So this is the kind of food we ended up eating in those kind of settings. Now, what I want to say is this. Through pain, through enduring pain for 27 years, constant pain for 27 years, with 3 herniated discs and stenosis, pain going down your leg, you can easily say, Lord, you've called me to travel. You've called me to do this. Why did you give me a body such as this? I have learned what Annie Johnston Flint said, who lived with cancer, blindness, arthritis of the rheumatoid kind, and she was orphaned. He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundaries known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus he giveth and giveth and giveth again. God sustains you. God empowers you. God enables you, and you draw closer through many of those times of agony. And the one thought I leave with you is this. There's a young gal in Georgia by the name of Ashlyn Blocker. She was featured in a Google picture this last week, and I think Katie Couric is interviewing the parents again. When the baby was born, the mother realized something was wrong because the baby didn't cry. The doctors never diagnosed anything. Everything was fine, till they found out she had CIPA, congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis. She doesn't feel any pain. No pain whatsoever. She could step on a nail, she could put a hand on a burner and not know that her hand is being burned. The mother ended her last interview, the last time I saw when the little gal was only about 10 or 12. She said, every night I go to bed saying, God, please give my little girl the ability to feel pain. In our finite world, if pain is an indicator of something that is wrong and gets us to seek the reality of finding help, is it impossible in the infinite mind of God to use the agency of pain through which to draw us and to bring us to the ultimate corrective? The greatest pain is ultimately that of the soul and the separation from God. So he is able to sustain you both in the physical and emotional struggles and in the deepest pain of all, that spiritual alienation. I'll leave that with you.
At this time, I think we'll be taking our last question, unfortunately, and we'll do it over here at the microphone. Michael.
Hello again, Ravi G. Super job. 2 thumbs up. This question is not for Ravi G, the scholar, or for the lecturer or the academician. This question is for Ravi G, the man of God. And I'm a firm believer in prayer. I just want to know if you would pray for my 2 brothers, Darren and Gray, that they would come to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior.
I will do that. You catch me immediately afterwards. Give me the name. We'll have a couple of minutes, and we'll do that. Thank you.
God bless.
Thank you. Yeah.
We'll do one more. I think we have. Go ahead.
Don't worry, I'll keep this brief. Well, I really respect what you're doing, but I just coming here out of a whim. I was just curious. You speak of tolerance and respectful discourse, and I really want to believe in that. But I was just curious as to your opinion on having what we could say as a respectful discourse as far as like LGBT rights and stuff like that, where it seems like a certain ideology would be have a strong conviction on that, and I want to know what would be a good way to get a good, respectful conversation going for more progress in that regard.
I mean, this has become obviously a very big issue, partly because, well, I think for a variety of reasons, and it certainly isn't helped by the shrill voices on both sides of the debate who actually make having any kind of discourse or conversation even harder. I'm aware a little bit, when I was speaking last in the US at Texas A&M in December, these questions came up, and I had some quite extended conversations for 2-3 hours after the meeting with a certain group of people. They'll talk about it with me, and this is the issue they wanted to discuss with me. And I think the question which American society has before it right now is twofold. One, who informs the moral convictions of a society, and where do they come from? Now, historically in the States, you've been very heavily influenced by the Christian faith and by the Judeo-Christian ethic. And what seems to be happening now is a question of whether that's actually the ethic that American society wants to embrace and to have. So that's going to be a conversation which is going to have to happen here, I guess, both politically as well as within academia and with every level of society. And I think that conversation should be encouraged. I think the next question will then be, what does it mean to have disagreement, and within a civil society, how do you allow that kind of diversity? Now, what I do find interesting about the debate is this. Both in ancient Greece and in Rome, in those societies, homosexual relationships were seen as being purer and higher than heterosexual ones. So the culture as a large had the conviction that homosexual love was of a purer and nobler form than heterosexual relationship. And even if you were married, having a homosexual relationship on the side was seen as being, and openly was being seen perfectly acceptable. And in some cases, some of the leaders in those societies would have been openly gay, and would have been applauded for it. What I do find interesting, however, is both in ancient Greece and in Rome, there was never any debate about changing the meaning of marriage, for example. So marriage was still classically understood. But even though homosexual relationships were viewed, as I say, as being on a more noble plane. So where I find the debate more concerning is using legislative force to start changing the meaning of words in the dictionary. That is something I find more concerning, and history doesn't seem to tell a very happy story of any society that resorts to legislative force to start rewriting the meaning of words. So I'm wondering if there are ways for this conversation to happen in a way that will take place, in a way that will allow as I say, people to be able to say on both sides what they actually believe and where they think they may be wrong, and then to find a way as a society to live that together. In Europe, we're having similar types of debates, and it's getting complicated. In France and in Germany, there have been debates about how much surgery should be allowed within a gay couple to allow them to have babies and to actually conceive if they're both men, because the technology is there now, but obviously it's very expensive to do that. Should that be permitted or not? And should the taxpayer have to pay for it? And you can imagine these kinds of debates are the kinds of debates that raise a very high temperature in the room. So I think if there's anything that can be done that will both defuse the temperature but also allow an actual discussion of the fundamental issues which are involved, I think they become very important. Another one of our colleagues, Os Guinness, I know in the book that Dr. Ravi referred to earlier, which talks about what we mean by civil society and freedom, I think has some very pertinent things to say into that particular issue and debate, and I feel comfortable with everything that he says there, and I would recommend it to be read. I don't know if there's much more that you would want to say.
I'd like to answer that, and Michael, if I may make a closing statement at that time and then turn it back to you. I want to thank you for that question, and I know in an audience like this there'll be many, many diverse views, certainly polarizing views on it, and so if you're here tonight of a different view and you hold to that firmly, I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you for giving us a hearing, because it must take a lot of every ounce of your own strength to be seated there listening to maybe a worldview that you're not comfortable with, because it may challenge some of your own worldview or however you want to live your life out. I make a plea in a couple of directions along with what Michael. Our team is based in about 10 countries, and we cover a lot of territory here with politicians, with business people, with academics. And politicians are beside themselves. They really have no answers. One of the political leaders in Africa put his arm in mine after I'd finished addressing the presidents there. He said, "Our cumulative wisdom is unable to meet the daunting challenges of our time. Our cumulative wisdom is unable to meet the daunting challenges of our time." But I want to say this, what we saw on the fiscal cliff is minor compared to what we would see in an amoral cliff. If we ever get to the top there, it'll be the devastation of so much. We go in many hostile settings, many inimical settings. I go in places where I've literally had to have armed guards who are there in case anything happens. I've always made a plea in the following way. The Christian view of marriage that Michael and I would hold is very different to the Islamic view of marriage. In the Quran, polygamy is provided for and allowed for. And it is mandated by their rules, but you can have a polygamous marriage. My own view of that is going back 5,000 years with Abraham. That became one of the factors in which it has created 5,000 years of turmoil in what happened in that household by virtue of what happened in that polygamous relationship and the offspring. And the blood that has been spilled for 5,000 years started as a war between two half-brothers over who had the right to the father's inheritance and spiritual inheritance and so on. But that has not kept Muslim people from inviting me to speak there. Michael is heading out to Cairo next week. This year I was in so many Islamic countries, and I've been in Islamic universities, the Islamic University of Malaysia, one of the oldest Islamic universities, with the sheikh sitting in front of me for a 1.5-hour open forum. I have a differing view on the sanctity of marriage to theirs, but they allow us to come and speak. Same with Buddhists. Buddhist monks have a different view of marriage than the Christian does. So also with the Catholic teaching on celibacy in the ministry. We don't hold to that as Protestant, evangelical Christians and so on. But that does not keep them from inviting us. We go and speak, and cordially we discuss, we disagree, and if we disagree, we do so not compromising our convictions. We'll speak in any settings. I spoke at the Mormon Tabernacle, the first non-Mormon to be invited there in 104 years after D.L. Moody, to speak at that. I don't hold to their view of marriage and so on. We well know that. But we respectfully deal with that. So my plea with the skeptic in these matters is, can we not still talk? Can we not still hear one another? Can you not give the Christian the chance to defend what it is about the sanctity of marriage that we actually see and why it is we hold that view? And wherever society ultimately goes, in an open arena of question, truth will ultimately triumph. Truth will win out, and the lie will be shown for what it really is. We are committed to be followers of Christ, and we will preach His word. And I thank you for giving us that opportunity. Let me just close with this simple illustration. Last year, after 40 years of travel, I experienced something that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I was invited to preach at the Angola prison in Louisiana, which has 5,300 hardcore prisoners. 85% of them are on life without parole. 45 of them are on death row. And you walk in and see 22, 23-year-old men who will never leave the prison, never walk out of there. and they jammed the auditorium when I was there to speak and address the issue of grace and forgiveness and redemption. When you walk past death row, you just go by there and they'll reach their hand out and they will grab your hand and ask you to pray for them. The chaplain, the warden who was there, a man by the name of Burl Cain, the girth of a southern sheriff, he walks like that, you know. He told the prison that he would come if they would let him do it his way. It was the bloodiest prison in the country. Blood marks on the walls, blood marks on the carpets. When you were checked in, you were given a knife to defend yourself. Today, it's the safest prison in the United States after a few years of Burl Cain being there. Bible verses all over the wall, all over the wall. And just before these guys go into the anteroom for their last meal, before they go to the execution, I'll never be the same after seeing that execution chamber. I could not handle it. When they tell you the stories of what happens, they just walk away from it. But I'll never forget sitting at that table, thinking what must go through the mind of a man as he's about to go to the execution table. But I looked up at the wall and there was a painting painted by a prisoner of Daniel in the lion's den. I said, "Who painted that?" The warden said, "A prisoner." I said, "Why?" He said, "He painted it telling the man about to be executed, you could still be rescued. Don't give up." And then I said, "What if it doesn't happen?" He said, "Look at that wall. Elijah with his chariots of fire taking the person to be with his Creator." And so the artist who was in prison said, if you're not rescued this way, you will be rescued that way. In every cell is a Bible. And the chaplain and somebody said, if we had more of these in our schools and our colleges, we'd need less of these in our prisons. The transformation of these minds and the men. When I left there, I got into the plane and we were silent, the five of us, silent. We just saw how tragic life can be, but what redemption can actually do, the transformation of a life. And that, only God is big enough to do that. And I pray if you've never come that way to Him, you'll give Him a chance in your life. And if you're an honest skeptic, keep hungering. For the Bible says, you shall search for me and find me when you shall search for me with all your heart. I hope we have the privilege of coming back here again. My thanks to everybody in the Veritas Forum for organizing and putting this together.